The Boston Boy Fiend, the Boy Torturer, and the Red Devil, just some of the many monikers of America's youngest ever serial killer, Jesse Harding Pomeroy. Born in November 1859 in Charlestown, Massachusetts, to parents Thomas Pomeroy, a US Civil War veteran and dockyard worker, and dressmaker Ruth Ann Snowman, Jesse was the second of two children. He had an elder brother, Charles, who was 2 years his senior. The Pomeroy family were extremely poor and lived in one of the most deprived slums in Boston, in Chelsea. From a young age, Jesse was victim to relentless bullying due to a number of factors. He was mentally deficient, rather large for his age, had a cleft lip, and most notably, he had a white film over his right eye, similar to a cataract. He also periodically suffered from epileptic seizures. Jesse also suffered abuse at the hands of his alcoholic father, Thomas, who beat him regularly in the outhouse with a belt or horsewhip, striking him hard until he bled. During these beatings, Pomeroy and his brother were also stripped of their clothing. As a youngster, Jesse spent much of his time by himself, reading books mainly surrounding Indian wars. When he played with local children, he would reenact the violence he'd read about. Jesse's dark side really started to reveal itself around the age of 11. Instead of being bullied, he became the bully, specifically targeting children who were younger and weaker than him. His behaviour also started to become increasingly disturbing towards animals, as it became apparent that Jesse tortured and killed a number of his mother's songbirds and even tortured a neighbour's cat with a knife. His mother was aware of this behaviour, but simply put it down to the abuse he had suffered in his early life. Little did she know the evil acts her son committed were about to take an even more sinister turn. In the winter of 1871, on December the 26th, a 4-year-old boy by the name of William Payne was found in an isolated outhouse on Powderhorn Hill, hanging from a ceiling beam by ropes around his wrists, suffering from hypothermia. 2 men heard a child's whimpers coming from the cabin before finding the child. William, known as Billy, was extremely traumatised and was half-dressed when he was found. According to reports, the boy had suffered repeated blunt force traumas and was tortured after being lured to the location by a quote-unquote older boy with brown hair, according to witnesses. The discovery of Billy Payne sent shockwaves through the community of Chelsea, with many believing a maniac was roaming the streets attacking young children. In the following months, similar attacks occurred. In February of 1872, a 7-year-old boy named Tracy Hayden was lured to Powderhorn Hill, where he was lashed with a whip repeatedly by the same perpetrator, after being stripped and threatened with the removal of his genitals by the perpetrator. Hayden's hands had been bound, and he had been beaten black and blue, with several of his teeth having been knocked out, and he had sustained a broken nose. Similarly to Billy, due to the severity of the attack and the traumatic events it had on them, neither could remember much about the assailant other than it was a boy around teenage age with brown hair. This left very little for the police to work with. In the spring, another attack took place involving 8-year-old Robert Bobby Meyer. On May the 20th, the perpetrator had promised to take Bobby to the Barnum Circus, but instead lured him to the outhouse, stripping him and beating him with a stick before forcing him to repeat curse words. According to Bobby, the perpetrator was fondling himself during the assault and, following completion, let Bobby go before fleeing the scene. He told Bobby that if he told anyone about what had happened, he would kill him. Following this third attack, the residents of Boston were terrified and angry that the police hadn't apprehended the criminal. Police decided to question as many brown-haired teenage boys as possible, but turned up nothing of significance. Terrified parents warned their children not to speak to strange teen boys, and during the subsequent media frenzy, a phantom, as it were, appeared in the newspapers, the attacker being described as a redhead with a wispy red beard, not a brown-haired teenager. The locals had become hysterical, and a whirlwind of rumours appeared left and right, so much so that many didn't know what was true and what was not. There was mass hysteria. Meanwhile, on July the 22nd, the so-called fiendish miscreant Jesse Pomeroy struck again. He attacked 7-year-old Johnny Balch, Pomeroy promising the boy 2 bits for running an errand. Johnny too, like the previous victims, had been bound, whipped and beaten whilst Jesse achieved sexual satisfaction, before threatening to kill the boy if he told anyone, before fleeing towards the swamps. Johnny regained his strength and tried to get help, but Jesse appeared and washed his wounds with salt water before leaving. By this time, the Boston Evening Transfer newspaper reported that a $500 reward was being offered to anyone who could find and apprehend the perpetrator. It also reported how local vigilantes were patrolling the streets in order to protect the citizens of Chelsea. Rather interestingly, shortly after the article was published, the Pomeroy family moved from Chelsea to South Boston. Many believe that Jesse's mother made the decision to do so, having had suspicions that her son was responsible for the despicable crimes being committed, but her undying loyalty to her son was next to none, and she was willing to do anything to protect him, despite his wrongdoings. But despite relocating, Jesse didn't stop his crime spree, and from then on, it got even worse. A very sickly 7-year-old George Pratt spent the morning of August the 17th walking along the shoreline looking for treasure before 12-year-old Jesse promised him 25 cents to run an errand. George was taken to the secluded outhouse before being bound and tortured in unimaginable ways. He was scratched and whipped before being tortured with a needle, Jesse puncturing the needle into George's chest, cheek, arm and genitals before trying to poke his eye with it, but the child managed to turn away before that could happen. If that wasn't bad enough, Jesse then turned extremely aggressive and bit a chunk of flesh from George's cheeks and buttocks. Less than a month later, on September the 5th, Jesse attacked 6-year-old Harry Austin, stripping him, beating him with a belt, and torturing him. Harry's hands were bound, and following Jesse's usual actions, he tried something new. He used a pocket knife to stab Harry under both armpits and beneath his shoulder blades. Jesse then attempted to remove Harry's genitalia, but he was startled by a passerby and fled. Only 6 days later, 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy was attacked in a similar fashion, his hands bound. He was lured to a nearby marsh where he was beaten and stabbed with a knife before Pomeroy ordered Joseph to kneel and recite a profane travesty of the Lord's Prayer. Following this, Jesse slashed Joseph's face with the knife before dragging him to the shoreline and washing his wounds with salt water. On September the 17th, 5-year-old Robert Gold was found lashed to a post by the railroad tracks in South Boston, having been lured there by an older boy who promised him he would see soldiers. When the pair were alone, Robert's clothes were removed, he was beaten and his head was slashed with a knife. Jesse placed the knife by the boy's throat, intending to do something he had never done before and kill him, but was once again startled when rail workers approached them and Pomeroy subsequently fled. But following this horrendous attack, a breakthrough finally came for the police. Robert noted Jesse's unique eye and referred to it as a marble eye because of the white film covering it, and 3 days later, police apprehended Jesse Pomeroy for the string of sickening crimes he had committed against young boys. On September the 21st, Joseph Kennedy was being questioned by police when Jesse, who was clearly a sociopath, entered the station of his own free will before deciding against confessing, but Joseph had already seen Pomeroy at the station and told police that he had attacked him. The police quickly followed suit and caught up with him. Clearly, Jesse believed this all to be some sort of sick and twisted game. Jesse was placed in a prison cell whilst police questioned him, but he proclaimed his innocence. The officers tried to get Pomeroy to confess by threatening him with a 100-year jail sentence, and this broke Jesse, who subsequently confessed to his crimes. The following day, he was transferred to the Boston State Prison, where each of his victims bravely confirmed that it was indeed 12-year-old Jesse Pomeroy who had attacked them. That afternoon, Jesse was put in front of the magistrate where the boys bravely recounted their stories, Jesse simply saying regarding the incidents, quote, "I couldn't help myself." His mother naturally defended her son, but regardless, the judge sent Jesse to the Westboro House of Reformation, where he was to remain until he turned 18 years old. But within a year and a half, Jesse was paroled and released after showing good behaviour, something which seemed planned. He was willing to do anything to escape, and believed that good behaviour would help his cause, and this proved to have worked. Unfortunately, his crime spree began again shortly afterwards, but this time he stooped even lower, to murder, and the locals were unaware of Jesse's release. The monster had returned to Boston. On March the 18th, 1874, just weeks after his release, Jesse Pomeroy's bloodlust returned when he attacked a 10-year-old girl named Katie Curran. He spent the early morning opening his mother's dressmaker's shop and setting up his brother's newspaper stand when he returned to the shop to sweep the floor with a friend of the family. Jesse and the friend were speaking when Katie entered the store, asking if they sold any notebooks that she could use for school. Jesse decided that she was his next victim. He asked his friend to visit the butcher's to collect scraps for the cats, and he left, leaving Jesse and Katie alone. Jesse told Katie that they may have notebooks down in the cellar, but when Katie followed, she felt that something was awry, but unfortunately it was too late to do anything about it. Jesse wrapped his hands around her neck and mouth and slashed her throat with a knife. He hid her body within an ash heap in a water closet, but when it was discovered later on, investigators couldn't conclusively say what other injuries the schoolgirl had sustained due to decomposition. It was noted, however, that her dress and undergarments had been sliced open, and Katie's torso and genitalia had been mutilated. Charles, Jesse's brother, then entered the store, which caused Jesse to panic. He quickly washed his hands in some pipe water and returned to the shop floor as if nothing had happened. Following Katie's disappearance, investigators traced her steps to Mrs. Pomeroy's dress shop, and Katie's mother suddenly fainted at the realisation that Jesse was working there, knowing full well of his previous criminal record. But despite this, the police captain told Mrs. Curran that Jesse had been fully rehabilitated and that he was not a further threat to the public. The captain even went so far to say that Jesse only attacked boys and that Katie was most likely wandering around somewhere and that they would find her safe and well, but these words came back to haunt him. Police did search Mrs. Pomeroy's shop, but fearful for her son, she ended their search early and told authorities to leave, unaware of the horrors that lay within the basement below. Meanwhile, Jesse continued to try and lure children with the promise of money, sweets, or a visit to the circus, though many managed to escape, knowing of stranger danger. A 5-year-old boy, Harry Field, was one of the children who made a narrow escape from Jesse's clutches. Jesse approached Harry and asked him if he knew where Vernon Street was, to which the boy confirmed that he did. Jesse then offered him some money to take him there, and the two went on their way. Once reaching Vernon Street, Harry asked for his 25 cents, but instead, Jesse continued walking with Harry in order to find the perfect remote spot to commit his next crime. Fortunately, when turning a corner, one of Jesse's acquaintances bumped into him, knowing of his past, and the pair began an altercation. Harry managed to flee and run back to the safety of his home. Unfortunately, the next child Jesse abducted was not so lucky. On the 22nd of April 1874, the mutilated body of 4-year-old Horace Millen was found on the marshes of Dorchester Bay, Horace being the final of Pomeroy's victims. One cold morning, Horace, who was from a more wealthy background, was given some money to buy a cake from a nearby bakery, and whilst walking there, he bumped into none other than the now 13-year-old Jesse Pomeroy, who suggested they visited the harbour after going to the bakery. Horace even offered to share his small cake with his new friend. Several witnesses reported seeing Jesse and Horace walking to the bakery and the harbour, though one witness saw Jesse looking over his shoulder several times, seemingly nervous, and it struck them as odd that little Horace, who was dressed very expensive upper-class clothing, was wandering out by the muddy marsh. The two sat by the marsh when Jesse, in a fit of rage, took out his pocket knife and slit Horace's throat. This didn't immediately kill him, so Jesse continued to stab him, but Horace used all his might to fight back, defensive wounds and his nails digging into his clenched up fists, proving that little Horace fought for his life. Unfortunately, there was no way that a 4-year-old could overpower a 13-year-old boy, and a puncture wound to the windpipe ultimately ended Horace's life. But even though he was now dead, Jesse continued to mutilate the boy's body, repeatedly and savagely stabbing him all over, 18 times in the chest and in the eye, before partially castrating him. His body was found at around 4 p.m. the same day by 2 young boys who were playing on the beach nearby. Due to the modus operandi in Horace's murder being similar to previous victims, though this was the most severe they had seen, police immediately went to find Jesse Pomeroy and arrested him at his home on Broadway the following day, scratch marks all over his face from little Horace fighting back. Once again, Pomeroy denied any wrongdoing when he was questioned, but he couldn't provide an alibi during the time in which Horace was believed to have been abducted and murdered. When asked about the scratches on his face, Pomeroy claimed he got them from shaving. Rather interestingly, when examining his clothing, marsh grass was found on his shoes, and a suspicious dark brown and reddish stain was found on a flannel shirt he was wearing. The 3-inch knife used was found at his residence, covered in mud and bloodstains on the handle. Both boys' shoe prints were also found on the marsh, which confirmed that they had indeed been in each other's company on the day Horace was killed. Upon further questioning, Jesse remained calm and collected, still proclaiming his innocence, this being a pointer towards sociopathic tendencies. The investigator who questioned Jesse asked him to visit the undertakers to view Horace's body, as since he claimed not to have committed the crime, he wouldn't have a problem with this. But Jesse hesitated and told them he did not want to go to the funeral parlour. Only upon seeing Horace's body did Jesse break down and admit to his crimes. He said, quote, "I'm sorry I did it. Please don't tell my mother. Put me somewhere so I can't do such things." It was clear that Jesse had psychological issues. He never had any reason to kill or attack any of his victims. Many refer to his despicable acts of violence as simply sport to him. He didn't know any of the children or their families and had no reason at all to harm them. There was no rational explanation or motive as to why he had so brutally attacked 8 children and murdered a 4-year-old boy and 10-year-old girl. He never even attempted to hide or cover up his crimes. In the summer of 1874, Jesse was put before the magistrate where he pleaded not guilty to his crimes, the grand jury indictment being in June. On July the 18th, Pomeroy finally admitted to killing Katie Curran after being told his mother and brother were arrested as suspected accomplices, and revealed where he had concealed her body in the basement of his mother's shop. Katie's body was recovered and a funeral was held for her 4 days later. A preliminary hearing was held in November, where doctors told the court of their belief that Jesse was insane. His trial for murdering Horace Millen began on December the 8th, the defence trying to get an acquittal by means of insanity. But 3 days later, on the 11th of December, 14-year-old Jesse Pomeroy was found guilty of first-degree murder by a jury and sentenced to 40 years of solitary confinement, the youngest person in American history to be found guilty of serial murder. Initially, Pomeroy was sentenced to hang, but after a year his sentence was downgraded to solitary confinement after 2 governors refused to sign a death warrant for a 16-year-old. He attempted to escape the prison on at least 12 occasions, though was unsuccessful in each. In 1917, aged 54, Jesse was released from solitary confinement and joined the general population within the prison. He spent mostly the remainder of his life behind bars before spending his final 3 years at Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane. He died on September the 29th, 1932, aged 72. The crimes of Jesse Pomeroy shocked the residents of Boston to its core, the shocking tale of a teenage serial killer making its way across the United States and beyond during the years that followed. It's highly likely that Jesse's bloodlust stemmed from the traumas of his abusive childhood, but nevertheless, there is never any justification when it comes to attacking and murdering the innocents of society. The surviving victims of the Fiend of Boston suffered mental and physical scars following the attacks, and the families of both Katie Curran and Horace Millen had to bury their children, something which no parent should ever have to do. There was simply no motive, no reason, these senseless crimes having been committed by none other than a 12-year-old boy, a child, and yet the trauma that was inflicted on his victims and their families would remain with them for the rest of their days.